In the decades immediately following the life of Christ, the nascent Christian movement was defined by an underlying and fiercely guarded principle of unity. This was not a unity of centralized administration, but a spiritual and doctrinal cohesion rooted in the direct authority of the apostles. From their initial base in Jerusalem, these first-generation leaders dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, carrying with them a specific set of teachings known as the kerygma, the core proclamation of Christ's death and resurrection. As they travelled, they founded small communities, or ecclesiae, in major urban centres from Antioch to Corinth, and eventually to Rome itself. The coherence of these geographically scattered assemblies was maintained through several vital mechanisms. The most crucial was the concept of apostolic teaching. The faith was not a matter of personal interpretation, but was a deposit to be preserved as it had been received from those who had walked with its founder. This preservation was actively managed through constant communication. The epistles, or letters, of apostles like Paul, Peter, and John functioned as the connective tissue of the early church, addressing doctrinal errors, settling community disputes, and reinforcing a shared identity. These documents reveal a profound consciousness of a single, universal body of believers. Furthermore, a consistent pattern of worship and initiation provided a common experience. The rites of baptism and the Eucharist were universally practiced, creating a shared liturgical language that transcended local cultural and linguistic differences. As the apostolic generation began to pass away, the principle of their authority was maintained through the establishment of apostolic succession. The apostles consecrated bishops to lead the communities they had founded, entrusting them with the duty of safeguarding the authentic faith. This episcopal structure, with a bishop overseeing each local church, became the primary guarantor of doctrinal consistency. The first significant test of this unified structure came with the question of Gentile inclusion. The Council of Jerusalem, convened around the year 49, addressed whether non-Jewish converts needed to adhere to Mosaic law. The resolution of this dispute, achieved through collegial debate among the apostles, established a vital precedent: that theological and disciplinary conflicts could be resolved through conciliar authority, thereby preserving the peace and unity of the one church. This early period, therefore, was characterized by a dynamic unity, a network of diverse communities bound by a common creed, shared rituals, and a universally recognized leadership structure derived directly from the apostles. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. As the Christian faith expanded from a persecuted sect into the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, its organizational structure necessarily evolved. The simple network of local bishoprics gave way to a more defined hierarchy, reflecting the political and cultural geography of the Roman world. Over time, the bishops of certain major cities began to exercise authority over their surrounding regions, leading to the formation of metropolitan sees. Out of this practical development, a formal system of 5 preeminent centers of authority emerged, a structure later known as the Pentarchy. Initially, 3 sees were held in special esteem due to their direct apostolic foundations and immense influence. The Church of Rome held a place of honor, traditionally founded by the apostles Peter and Paul, and situated in the imperial capital. The Church of Alexandria, a vibrant center of Hellenistic learning, became the intellectual powerhouse of early Christianity, wielding vast authority over the churches in Egypt and Libya. The Church of Antioch, where the followers of Christ were first called Christians and which claimed the Apostle Peter as its first bishop, stood as the leading see in Syria and the East. To these 3, a 4th was added out of reverence for its unique history. Jerusalem, the mother church from which the faith had sprung, was granted a special honorary status, though its jurisdictional power was initially limited following the city's destruction and rebuilding. The most significant and contentious development was the rise of Constantinople. Lacking any direct apostolic foundation, its claim to prominence was purely political. When Emperor Constantine established the city as the New Rome in 330, it became the administrative heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. Ecclesiastical rank soon followed imperial prestige. The First Council of Constantinople in 381 declared that the Bishop of Constantinople should have primacy of honour after the Bishop of Rome, because it is the New Rome. This principle was solidified at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, whose Canon 28 granted Constantinople equal privileges to Old Rome and authority over vast territories. This decision formally established the system of 5 patriarchates, but it also embedded a fundamental conflict into the Church's structure. Rome argued that its primacy was a matter of divine institution derived from Christ's commission to Peter. Constantinople's authority, by contrast, was a product of imperial decree. This clash between apostolic and political principles of authority created a fault line that would run through the heart of Christendom for the next 6 centuries. From the earliest centuries, the Church of Rome asserted a unique role for itself, a claim not of administrative convenience, but of divine mandate. This concept of Roman primacy was built upon the Petrine doctrine, the belief that the Bishop of Rome was the direct successor to the Apostle Peter. The scriptural foundation for this was the passage in the Gospel of Matthew, where Christ grants Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven, a commission interpreted in the West as the establishment of a singular, earthly head for the Church. This theological claim distinguished Rome from all other sees. Its authority was not a gift from emperors or councils, but stemmed from Christ himself. Historical evidence demonstrates that this was not merely a local Roman belief. As early as 96 AD, Pope Clement I intervened in the internal affairs of the Church in Corinth, writing an authoritative letter to settle a dispute, an act that presupposed a sense of responsibility for communities beyond his immediate jurisdiction. A century later, Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon in Gaul, explicitly stated that all churches must be in agreement with the Church of Rome because of its preeminent authority. This early deference was reinforced by Rome's practical position. It was the city of the Caesars, and its bishop naturally commanded immense prestige. Furthermore, it was the only see in the West that could claim an apostolic foundation, making its bishop the natural leader for Latin-speaking Christendom. The city's status was uniquely enhanced by the tradition that both Peter and Paul had been martyred and buried there, endowing it with the unparalleled legacy of the 2 chief apostles. Throughout the great doctrinal controversies of the 4th and 5th centuries, theologians and bishops from the East frequently appealed to Rome as a final arbiter of orthodoxy. Pope Leo the Great, in the mid-5th century, provided the most systematic articulation of this primacy. Drawing on Roman legal principles, he defined the Pope not merely as a successor, but as the legal heir of Peter, inheriting his full authority. His tome, a doctrinal letter read at the Council of Chalcedon, was a decisive intervention in the Christological debates and marked a high point of Roman influence. Yet, this Roman understanding of primacy was never fully accepted in the East. The Eastern patriarchs acknowledged a primacy of honour for the Bishop of Rome, recognizing him as the first among equals. They did not, however, concede to him a universal jurisdictional supremacy. They viewed the Church as a collegial body governed by the 5 patriarchs in council, not as a monarchy ruled by one. This fundamental disagreement over the nature and source of authority was the deepest root of the coming schism. The political centre of gravity of the Roman Empire shifted irrevocably eastward with a single monumental decision by Emperor Constantine the Great. By the early 4th century, the city of Rome, while still possessing immense symbolic prestige, had become strategically obsolete. It was too far from the empire's most threatened frontiers on the Danube and in Persia, and its senatorial class often represented a source of political opposition. Constantine, a military emperor who understood the necessity of a capital that could project power, sought a new administrative and military hub. his choice fell upon the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, a location of unparalleled strategic value. Situated on a triangular peninsula, it commanded the Bosphorus Strait, the sole maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, while also controlling the overland route between Europe and Asia. This defensible and commercially vital position was to become the heart of a new Christian empire. The transformation of Byzantium into Constantinople was an imperial project of staggering scale and speed. Beginning in 324, Constantine poured the vast resources of the state into its construction. He laid out new walls that quadrupled the city's size, built forums, palaces, a hippodrome, and the necessary administrative buildings to house a new imperial government. To populate his capital and grant it instant legitimacy, he offered incentives for aristocrats to relocate from Rome and established a new Senate. The city was consciously designed not as a provincial capital but as a co-equal to Rome itself. On May 11, 330, the city was formally consecrated as Nova Roma, or New Rome. Unlike the old capital, which was steeped in pagan tradition, this new centre was explicitly Christian from its inception, its public spaces adorned with churches instead of temples. This act had profound and immediate ecclesiastical consequences. The bishop of the relatively minor see of Byzantium was suddenly elevated to a position of immense influence as the prelate of the emperor's own city. This new prominence was not based on any apostolic claim, but was a direct result of the city's political status. The creation of a second imperial capital in the east inevitably created a rival for the old one in the west, establishing a political and religious duality that would define the Christian world for the next millennium. The stage was now set for a protracted rivalry between the bishops of Old and New Rome, a contest for prestige and authority that would strain the unity of the Church to its breaking point. Beneath the political and ecclesiastical rivalries, a more fundamental divide was cleaving Christendom in two: the divergence of language. While the Roman Empire was officially bilingual, in practice it comprised two distinct linguistic spheres. In the East, Greek remained the language of culture, commerce, and intellectual life. It was the language in which the New Testament was written, and the tongue in which the early ecumenical councils debated the most profound mysteries of the faith. The great theological formulations of Athanasius, Basil, and the Cappadocian Fathers were all composed in the subtle and philosophically rich vocabulary of Hellenism. Even in the city of Rome, Greek was the predominant language of the Christian community for the first 2 centuries. In the West, however, Latin gradually asserted its dominance. Initially the language of law and administration, it became the primary vehicle for theological expression through the work of North African writers like Tertullian, Cyprian, and later Augustine of Hippo. As Latin developed its own distinct theological vocabulary, a parallel intellectual tradition took root. By the 5th century, this linguistic separation was becoming a chasm of misunderstanding. Knowledge of Greek became a rarity in the West, while in the East, Latin was seen as the crude language of soldiers and administrators, unsuitable for sophisticated theological discourse. This meant that direct communication between the leading minds of the Church became increasingly difficult. Theologians had to rely on translations, which were often slow to arrive and fraught with peril. Key theological terms simply did not have perfect one-to-one equivalents. The Greek word hypostasis, crucial in defining the persons of the Trinity, could be translated into Latin as substantia, but substantia was also the translation for the Greek word ousia, meaning essence. This linguistic ambiguity fueled decades of controversy, with each side suspecting the other of heresy simply because of the different nuances their languages carried. This linguistic divide fostered 2 different ways of thinking. The Greek-speaking East, heir to the philosophical traditions of Plato and Aristotle, tended towards a more speculative, mystical, and paradoxical approach to theology. The Latin-speaking West, shaped by Roman law and rhetoric, developed a theology that was more practical, systematic, and juridical in its reasoning. They were not merely speaking different languages. They were beginning to inhabit different intellectual and spiritual worlds. The 5th century witnessed the catastrophic political and military disintegration of the Western Roman Empire, a process that physically and psychologically severed Rome from the still thriving East. Beginning with the crossing of the Rhine in 406 by a host of Germanic tribes and culminating in the sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, imperial authority in the West began to crumble. The intricate network of roads, sea lanes, and administrative structures that had facilitated regular contact with Constantinople fractured and collapsed. By the middle of the century, the former western provinces were no longer under imperial control but had been carved into a mosaic of independent barbarian kingdoms. The Vandals controlled North Africa, the Visigoths held Spain and southern Gaul, and the Franks were consolidating their power in the north. This new political map made direct communication between the sees of Rome and Constantinople perilous and sporadic. Where once imperial couriers and church emissaries travelled with relative security, they now had to navigate through territories controlled by Arian Germanic kings who were often hostile to both Old Rome and New Rome. The final deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476, was not a singular cataclysm, but the formal recognition of a reality that had existed for decades. The West was gone. This political vacuum fundamentally altered the position of the Bishop of Rome. With no emperor in Italy, the Pope increasingly assumed the mantle of civil leadership, becoming the primary protector of the Roman populace and the chief negotiator with the new Germanic rulers. This forced self-reliance fostered a powerful sense of independence and enhanced the Pope's authority within the West, but it also deepened the estrangement from the East. In Constantinople, the Roman Empire continued, and the emperor still viewed himself as the sovereign of the entire Christian world. Yet, his ability to project power into Italy became negligible. While the Eastern Church remained integrated into the imperial state structure, the Western Church was now forced to chart its own course amidst a fragmented and politically volatile landscape. The shared political world that had nurtured the early Church was shattered, leaving two distinct Christian civilizations to evolve along separate and increasingly divergent paths. While the Western Church was learning to survive without an emperor, the Eastern Church became ever more deeply integrated with the imperial state, creating a model of church-state relations that was fundamentally different from the one evolving in Rome. In Constantinople, the emperor was not merely a secular ruler who protected the church. He was an active participant in its governance and theological life. This system, sometimes labelled Caesaropapism, saw the emperor as the living icon of Christ on earth, entrusted with the welfare of both the empire and the faith. His role transcended mere politics. He was considered a sacred figure, the vicegerent of God, whose duty was to maintain orthodoxy and ensure the proper administration of the church. This imperial authority was expressed in several concrete ways. It was the emperor, not the patriarch, who had the authority to convene ecumenical councils. From Nicaea in 325, summoned by Constantine, to later councils called by emperors like Theodosius and Justinian, the supreme legislative bodies of the church met at the command of the state. The emperor would often preside over these gatherings, guide their debates, and, most crucially, give their decisions the force of imperial law. A council's canons were not merely ecclesiastical regulations, they were the laws of the Roman Empire, and heresy was treated as a form of treason. Furthermore, the emperor played a decisive role in the selection of the Patriarch of Constantinople. While the process involved a synod of bishops, the emperor had the final say and could depose patriarchs who fell out of his favour. This power dynamic ensured that the head of the Eastern Church was almost always aligned with imperial policy. This deep symbiosis between throne and altar created a stable and powerful Christian empire in the East, but it also meant that the Eastern Church's fortunes were inextricably tied to those of the state. To the increasingly independent popes in Rome, this looked like subservience. From the Roman perspective, the Church was a universal spiritual body that stood above all temporal rulers. In the East, the Empire and the Church were seen as two facets of a single divinely ordained Christian society. This profound difference in the understanding of power and authority would become a major source of friction. The growing estrangement between the Greek East and Latin West was not only a matter of politics or language, but was rooted in deeply ingrained and divergent intellectual traditions. The two halves of the Christian world inherited different philosophical toolkits, which led them to ask different questions and formulate their faith in different ways. The Eastern theological mind was fundamentally shaped by the legacy of classical Greek philosophy, particularly the speculative traditions of Plato and the Neoplatonists. Centered in the great intellectual hubs of Alexandria and Antioch, Eastern theology was often approached as a mystical and contemplative discipline. Its primary goal was not so much to define God in precise legalistic terms, as it was to guide the believer toward theosis, or deification, the mystical union with God. This led to a preference for apophatic theology, which emphasizes that God is ultimately beyond all human concepts, and can be better described by what he is not than by what he is. The liturgy itself, with its rich symbolism and iconography, was considered a primary form of theological expression, a window into divine mysteries that transcended rational explanation. The West, by contrast, was the heir to the Roman traditions of law, rhetoric, and administration. Latin theology developed a character that was more practical, systematic, and juridical. For Western thinkers like Tertullian, and most decisively, Augustine of Hippo, theology was a science to be organized, a body of truth to be defended with logical precision. The central questions often revolved around the practical mechanics of salvation, the nature of sin, the operation of grace, and the structure of the Church as a divinely ordained institution. This approach created a theological language rich with legal metaphors. Sin was a debt owed to God, Christ's sacrifice was a satisfaction for that debt, and the Church was a visible hierarchical society with clear laws and lines of authority. These were not yet two separate religions, but they were developing distinct intellectual personalities. When a theological question arose, an Eastern theologian was likely to approach it with philosophical speculation and appeals to the mystical consensus of the Church Fathers. A Western theologian was more inclined to seek a clear, logical definition and to ground it in the legal authority of the Roman See. This difference in method meant that even when they used the same words, they often spoke past one another, their minds shaped by different worlds of thought. The first great theological storm to engulf the entire Christian world erupted not from external persecution, but from within the intellectual heart of the Church, Alexandria. In the early 4th century, a presbyter named Arius began to preach a doctrine that struck at the very core of Christian belief about the nature of Christ. Drawing from certain Greek philosophical traditions, Arius taught that the Son, the Logos, was not co-eternal with God the Father. He argued that the Son was a creature, the first and most perfect of all created beings, but a creature nonetheless. His famous dictum, "There was a time when he was not," summarized a position that subordinated the Son to the Father, denying their equal divinity. This teaching immediately brought him into conflict with his bishop, Alexander of Alexandria, who championed the view that the Son was fully divine and had existed with the Father from all eternity. The dispute quickly escalated beyond a local disagreement, spreading like wildfire through the eastern provinces as bishops, theologians, and the laity took sides. The controversy threatened to tear the Church apart, creating a level of internal division that alarmed the newly converted Emperor Constantine. For Constantine, who saw a unified Christian Church as essential for the stability of his empire, this theological civil war was an intolerable political crisis. His solution was unprecedented in the history of the Church. He summoned all the bishops of the Christian world to a great council at Nicaea in 325. This was the first ecumenical council, a gathering of over 300 bishops, primarily from the East, financed and protected by the Roman state. The council's central task was to definitively rule on the Arian question. After intense debate, the council overwhelmingly rejected Arius's teachings. To codify their decision and prevent future ambiguity, they formulated a creed, a statement of faith, the crucial non-scriptural term they inserted was homoousios, a Greek word meaning of one substance or consubstantial. This single word declared unequivocally that the Son was of the very same divine essence as the Father, not merely a similar or subordinate being. The resulting Nicene Creed became the benchmark of orthodoxy, and Arius was formally condemned and exiled. Nicaea was a landmark event, establishing the precedent of using councils to define doctrine for the entire Church, but it did not end the struggle. Arianism, in various forms, would continue to challenge the Nicene faith for more than half a century, often with the support of Constantine's own successors. With the divinity of Christ affirmed at Nicaea, the theological focus of the 5th century shifted to an even more complex question. How did the divine and human natures coexist in the single person of Jesus Christ? This question ignited 2 generations of bitter controversy, centered on the rival theological schools of Alexandria and Antioch, and it would require 2 more ecumenical councils to resolve, leaving permanent divisions in their wake. The first major crisis was sparked by Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople. Influenced by the Antiochene school, which emphasized the distinctness of Christ's humanity, Nestorius taught that the divine and human natures in Christ were joined in a loose moral union, or conjunction, rather than a true personal union. The practical and explosive consequence of this view was his rejection of the traditional title Theotokos, or God-bearer, for the Virgin Mary. He argued that Mary bore the human Jesus, not the divine Logos, and should instead be called Christotokos, Christ-bearer. This was seen by many, most powerfully by Cyril, the formidable Patriarch of Alexandria, as dividing Christ into 2 separate persons. Cyril championed the Alexandrian view of a hypostatic union, a deep personal joining of the 2 natures in the one person of the Son. The conflict came to a head at the Council of Ephesus in 431. In a politically charged and tumultuous session, Cyril and his supporters condemned and deposed Nestorius before the arrival of the Antiochene bishops, affirming Theotokos as orthodox doctrine. The reaction against Nestorianism, however, soon swung to the opposite extreme. In Constantinople, a monk named Eutyches began teaching that after the Incarnation, Christ possessed only a single nature, a monophysis. He argued that Christ's divine nature had effectively absorbed his human nature, much as a drop of honey is absorbed by the sea. This doctrine, monophysitism, was seen as a denial of Christ's true humanity. To settle this new controversy, Emperor Marcion convened the Council of Chalcedon in 451, the largest of the ancient councils. After reviewing the previous debates, the Council Fathers formulated a definitive statement. The Chalcedonian definition declared that Christ is one person existing in 2 natures, unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. This became the touchstone of orthodoxy for both Rome and Constantinople. However, it was rejected by a significant portion of the Eastern Church, particularly in Egypt and Syria, leading to the first lasting schism and the birth of the non-Chalcedonian or Oriental Orthodox churches. The theological settlement of Chalcedon, while definitive for Rome and Constantinople, had failed to pacify the eastern provinces. In Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, Monophysite dissent was not only widespread, but had become a marker of regional identity against the perceived imperialism of the capital. The constant unrest posed a severe threat to the political stability of the Eastern Empire. In an effort to restore unity, the Emperor Zeno, advised by the politically astute Patriarch Acacius of Constantinople, sought a theological compromise. In 482, Zeno issued an edict of union known as the Henoticon. This document was a masterpiece of deliberate ambiguity. It affirmed the faith of the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople, formally condemned both Nestorius and Eutyches, and accepted the anathemas of Cyril of Alexandria. Crucially, however, it made no mention of the Council of Chalcedon or its controversial definition of Christ existing in 2 natures. The Henoticon was intended to be a formula that both Chalcedonians and moderate Monophysites could accept, thereby healing the internal divisions of the East. While it achieved some success in reconciling Eastern factions, it was viewed in Rome as an intolerable betrayal. Pope Felix III saw the imperial edict not as a pastoral compromise, but as an attack on the authority of an ecumenical council and a flagrant example of an emperor dictating doctrine. For Rome, the Chalcedonian definition was non-negotiable truth. After his legates to Constantinople were imprisoned and coerced into accepting the new formula, Felix convened a synod in Rome in 484. The synod formally condemned the Henoticon and took the dramatic step of excommunicating Patriarch Acacius. Since Acacius was acting with the full support of the emperor, this act placed the entire Eastern Church, from the emperor down, out of communion with Rome. The Eastern Church responded by removing the Pope's name from the diptychs, the official list of patriarchs commemorated at the liturgy. This began the Acacian Schism, the first major and prolonged break between the Eastern and Western churches, which would last for 35 years. Communion was not restored until 519, when a new, staunchly Chalcedonian emperor, Justin I, agreed to Roman demands. The healing of the schism required the Eastern bishops to sign the Formula of Hormisdas, a document that strongly asserted Roman primacy and condemned Acacius. Though the immediate crisis was resolved, it had established a dangerous precedent and left a legacy of deep mistrust. The ascension of Emperor Justinian I in 527 marked the beginning of a dramatic, costly, and ultimately ephemeral attempt to reverse the verdict of the previous century. Fueled by the potent ideology of Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the restoration of the empire of the Romans Justinian sought to reclaim the lost western provinces from their Germanic rulers. This was not merely a military ambition but a theological one, driven by the conviction that the one Roman Empire should be united under one orthodox emperor. The first target was the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. In 533, Justinian dispatched his brilliant general, Belisarius, who achieved a stunningly rapid victory, dismantling the Vandal state in less than a year and restoring the vital province of Africa to imperial control. This swift success created a deceptive sense of momentum and emboldened Justinian to turn his attention to the ultimate prize, Italy, the heartland of the old empire, now under the rule of the Ostrogoths. The Gothic War, launched in 535, would prove to be a far different undertaking. What was envisioned as another swift campaign devolved into a brutal, 2-decade-long struggle that ravaged the Italian peninsula. Belisarius and later the general Narses led imperial armies through a grueling series of sieges, battles, and counter-offensives. Cities like Rome, Naples, and Milan were repeatedly captured and recaptured, their populations decimated, and their infrastructure destroyed. The war bled the Eastern Empire of its treasure and its manpower, requiring enormous logistical efforts to sustain armies thousands of miles from their supply bases in Constantinople. By 554, the Ostrogothic kingdom was finally extinguished, and Italy was once again a Roman province. For a brief moment, the Mediterranean was an imperial lake, and Justinian's dream of restoration seemed realized. The pragmatic reconquest had significant ecclesiastical consequences, as it brought the papacy in Rome back under the direct political control of the emperor in Constantinople for the first time in generations. Yet the victory was Pyrrhic. Italy was left ruined and depopulated, a shadow of its former self. The empire was financially exhausted, and its eastern frontiers were left dangerously exposed to the rising power of Persia. The restored unity was a fragile illusion, achieved at a cost that made its long-term survival impossible. Just as the Byzantine Empire exhausted itself in the monumental effort of Western reconquest, it became locked in a final cataclysmic war with its traditional rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire. For over 2 decades, from 602 to 628, the two great powers of the late antique world fought each other to a standstill, leaving both empires financially ruined, demographically depleted, and militarily overstretched. This mutual exhaustion created a power vacuum in the Near East at the precise historical moment that a new, unified force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Galvanized by the monotheistic faith of Islam, Arab armies possessing superior mobility and a potent ideological motivation erupted out of the desert. Their expansion was unprecedented in its speed and scale. In 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk, a Byzantine army was decisively annihilated, resulting in the permanent loss of Syria and Palestine to the new caliphate. Just a year later, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the Sasanian army was crushed, leading to the swift collapse of the centuries-old Persian Empire. Within a single generation, the political and religious map of the world was violently redrawn. For Christendom, the consequences were catastrophic. 3 of the 5 ancient patriarchates, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, were permanently absorbed into the Islamic world. While Christian communities survived under Muslim rule, their leaders were now cut off from the theological and political life of the wider church. The Pentarchy, as a functioning collegial body, ceased to exist. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, became a contested frontier between Christendom and the Dar al-Islam. This geopolitical earthquake profoundly altered the structure of the remaining church. Constantinople, once the first among several Eastern patriarchates, now stood alone as the sole bastion of imperial Christianity in the East, its identity forged in a state of permanent siege against a powerful new religious and military rival. Rome, already politically detached from the East, was now even more profoundly isolated. The loss of the ancient sees of Alexandria and Antioch removed the traditional counterweights to Constantinople's influence in the East, intensifying the direct rivalry between the 2 remaining major centers of the Christian world. The church was now effectively a diarchy, dominated by a Latin-speaking pope in a fragmented West and a Greek-speaking patriarch in a beleaguered Eastern Empire. By the late 7th century, a full century had passed since the last ecumenical council had issued any disciplinary laws or canons. The 5th and 6th ecumenical councils had dealt exclusively with complex doctrinal matters, leaving a host of practical and disciplinary issues unaddressed. To remedy this, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II convened a council in 692, held in the domed hall or trullis of the imperial palace in Constantinople. This gathering, known as the Quinisext Council, or the Council in Trullo, was intended to be a purely Eastern affair, a legislative session to bring order to the Church's internal life. It was not intended to create new doctrine, but its canons would expose the widening chasm of custom that now separated Constantinople from Rome. The council produced 102 canons regulating every aspect of church life, from the conduct of clergy to the practices of the laity. While many were universally applicable, a significant number were direct and explicit condemnations of practices common in the West, particularly in Rome. The council decreed that married men could be ordained as priests and deacons, directly repudiating the growing Roman insistence on clerical celibacy. It forbade the practice of fasting on Saturdays during Lent, a custom specific to the Roman Church. Another canon mandated that Christ should be depicted in his human form rather than symbolically as a lamb, a common motif in Western art. Furthermore, the council endorsed a collection of 85 apostolic canons as authoritative, while the Roman Church had only ever accepted a list of 50. The cumulative effect of these canons was to codify Greek custom as the universal norm and to legislate against Latin practices. When the canons were sent to Rome for papal approval, Pope Sergius I flatly refused to sign them. He recognized the council for what it was, an attempt by the Eastern Church, under the aegis of the emperor, to impose its own discipline on the entire Christian world and to implicitly condemn Roman traditions. The Emperor Justinian II, infuriated by this defiance, dispatched an official to arrest the Pope and bring him to Constantinople. The attempt failed spectacularly. The local militias in Italy, loyal to the Pope and resentful of Byzantine authority, rose up and forced the imperial envoy to flee for his life. This incident starkly revealed the new reality. The emperor no longer had the power to coerce the Pope. The Quinisext Council, though never accepted in the West, became fundamental to Eastern canon law. It was a formal declaration that the 2 halves of Christendom were no longer just speaking different languages. They were now living by different rules. Of all the disputes that divided the Eastern and Western churches, none was more theologically dense or persistently divisive than the controversy over the filioque. The term, a Latin phrase meaning "and the Son," refers to its addition into the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. The original creed, as finalized by the ecumenical councils of the 4th century, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. This formulation was universally accepted by the entire Church and was considered an unalterable foundation of the faith. The origins of the addition were not in Rome, but in 6th century Visigothic Spain. There, the local church was engaged in a long struggle against a resilient form of Arianism. To bolster the orthodox teaching of Christ's full divinity, Spanish theologians began to emphasize the Son's role in the origin of the Holy Spirit. At the Third Council of Toledo in 589, the Spanish Church formally inserted the filioque into the creed, making it read that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. The intention was purely local and anti-Arian, to declare that the Son was so fully equal to the Father that he too was a source of the Spirit. From Spain, the practice slowly migrated into the Frankish kingdom. It was enthusiastically adopted by the court of Charlemagne, who saw it as a mark of theological sophistication and sought to make it the standard throughout his empire. At the Synod of Frankfurt in 794, he officially endorsed the clause. This Frankish adoption transformed a local Spanish custom into a major theological issue. The Eastern Church, when it became aware of this innovation, was horrified on 2 grounds. Theologically, it was seen as a distortion of the Trinity, violating the monarchy of the Father as the sole source or fount of divinity. Ecclesiologically, it was an illegal, unilateral alteration of the creed of an ecumenical council, an act of profound indiscipline. For centuries, the popes in Rome found themselves in a difficult position. They agreed with the theology behind the filioque, but strongly resisted its insertion into the creed, defending the integrity of the original text. Pope Leo III famously had the original Greek and Latin creed, without the filioque, engraved on silver shields and placed in St. Peter's Basilica as a permanent witness against any alteration. However, under pressure from the powerful German emperors, the clause was finally adopted into the liturgy in Rome in the early 11th century, turning a Frankish innovation into an official Roman practice and creating an intractable theological obstacle to unity. In the year 726, the Byzantine Emperor Leo III, a ruler from the military heartlands of Anatolia, initiated a theological revolution that would plunge the empire into more than a century of violent internal conflict and irrevocably damage relations with the West. He began a systematic campaign against the veneration of sacred images, or icons, a practice that had become deeply embedded in the devotional life of the Eastern Church. This policy of iconoclasm, or image-breaking, was driven by a complex mixture of theological conviction and political calculation. Theologically, the iconoclasts argued that the veneration of images was a violation of the second commandment against idolatry. This view was likely influenced by the aniconic traditions of the empire's new and powerful neighbors, Islam and Judaism, and was particularly strong among the army and the populace of the eastern provinces. Politically, Leo and his successors saw the widespread and often unregulated cult of icons, particularly those controlled by the powerful monastic communities, as a threat to imperial and ecclesiastical order. By attacking the images, the emperors were also attacking the independent power base of the monasteries. The implementation of the policy was brutal. In 730, Leo issued a formal edict demanding the destruction of all religious images. Imperial troops were dispatched to strip icons from churches, whitewash frescoes and smash mosaics. The most ferocious resistance came from the monks, who became the chief defenders of the images and the primary victims of the subsequent persecution. Monasteries were dissolved, their property confiscated, and monks were imprisoned, tortured, and martyred for their refusal to comply. In Rome, the reaction was one of immediate and absolute condemnation. Pope Gregory II and his successor, Pope Gregory III, saw the emperor's actions as a horrifying heresy and an illegitimate intrusion of secular power into the domain of faith. The popes argued that the emperor had no authority to define doctrine. In a series of letters and councils, they anathematized the iconoclasts and staunchly defended the ancient tradition of venerating sacred images. This defiance was a turning point. For the first time, the papacy was not just disagreeing with Constantinople on a point of discipline, but was leading the opposition to the official, state-enforced theology of the Eastern Emperor. The controversy raged for decades until 787, when the Empress Irene, acting as regent, convened the Second Council of Nicaea. This council, fully supported by the papacy, formally restored the veneration of icons, carefully defining the distinction between honorable veneration proskynesis, paid to an image, and true worship, latreia, which is reserved for God alone. Though a second wave of iconoclasm would follow, the Roman Church's unwavering defense of images during the crisis created a profound theological and political breach, driving the papacy to seek a more reliable protector than the heretical emperor in Constantinople. The final rupture with the iconoclast emperors in Constantinople left the papacy in a perilous position. While theologically defiant, it was militarily vulnerable in Italy. The Byzantine exarch in Ravenna, the emperor's official representative, lacked the resources and the political will to protect Rome from the relentless pressure of the Lombards, a Germanic tribe that controlled most of northern and central Italy. The Lombards, having conquered much of the peninsula, now sought to capture Rome itself, threatening the very existence of the papacy as an independent institution. Finding no reliable protector in the east, the popes made a momentous decision to reorient their political allegiance toward the new dominant power in the west, the Franks. The Franks, unlike other Germanic tribes who had converted to Arianism, had embraced Catholic Christianity under their king Clovis in the late 5th century. This shared orthodoxy made them the natural allies for a papacy desperate for a military champion. The first formal appeal came in 739, when Pope Gregory III sent a desperate plea to the Frankish mayor of the palace, Charles Martel, for aid against the Lombard king Liutprand. Although Martel was unable to intervene at the time, a crucial precedent had been set. The decisive step came a decade later. In 751, Pepin the Short, Charles Martel's son and successor, sought to depose the last powerless Merovingian king and claim the crown for himself. To legitimize this coup, he appealed to Pope Zachary, who gave his sanction, declaring that it was better for the one with the real power to hold the title of king. This act was revolutionary. The Bishop of Rome was now acting as a kingmaker, bestowing legitimacy on a new European dynasty. The alliance was sealed in 754, when Pope Stephen II, fleeing a renewed Lombard threat, made a historic journey across the Alps to meet Pepin in person. At the Abbey of Saint-Denis, Stephen personally anointed Pepin and his sons, including the young Charlemagne, formally consecrating the Carolingian dynasty. In return, Pepin led his army into Italy, decisively defeated the Lombards, and in an act known as the Donation of Pepin, granted the captured territories of central Italy to the papacy. This donation created the legal foundation for the Papal States, turning the Pope into a temporal sovereign. The papacy had found its new protector. It had exchanged its nominal allegiance to a distant and heretical emperor in Constantinople for a tangible military and political alliance with the rising Catholic power of the West. The political reorientation of the papacy culminated in an act of breathtaking audacity on Christmas Day in the year 800. In St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed an imperial crown on the head of the Frankish king, Charlemagne, while the assembled Roman populace acclaimed him as emperor. This event was not a spontaneous gesture, but a carefully orchestrated political act with profound and permanent consequences for the Christian world. For the first time in over 3 centuries, there was an emperor in the West, one whose authority was derived not from the lineage of the Caesars, but from the sanction of the Bishop of Rome. This coronation was a direct and deliberate challenge to the legitimacy of the emperor in Constantinople, who was still officially regarded as the sole Roman emperor. The timing was significant. The imperial throne in Constantinople was at that moment occupied by the Empress Irene, a woman. In the legal and political theory of the West, this meant the imperial throne was effectively vacant, providing the papacy with a pretext to act. The creation of a new Western empire formalized the political divorce that had been developing for centuries. It shattered the long-held ideal of a single, universal Christian empire, replacing it with a new reality of two rival imperial powers, one Latin and one Greek. The act also fundamentally redefined the relationship between the Pope and the Emperor in the West. By crowning Charlemagne, Pope Leo III asserted the principle that imperial authority flowed through the papacy, establishing a precedent for papal supremacy over temporal rulers that would shape the course of Western European history. In Constantinople, the news of Charlemagne's coronation was met with outrage and contempt. They viewed the Frankish king as an uncultured barbarian usurper, and the Pope's action as an act of rebellion. The Byzantines never recognized the legitimacy of this new Western empire, referring to Charlemagne and his successors not as Roman emperors, but merely as king of the Franks. The political schism was now complete. Two rival emperors, each claiming the universal inheritance of Rome, and each supported by a distinct ecclesiastical structure, now glared at each other across the Adriatic. This political sundering created an almost insurmountable barrier to church unity, as ecclesiastical disputes would henceforth be entangled in the rivalries of competing empires. The Frankish alliance provided the papacy with more than just a military shield. It created an entirely new political entity in the heart of Italy. The legal basis for this was the donation of Pepin in 756. After defeating the Lombards, the Frankish king did not return the conquered lands of the Exarchate of Ravenna and the Pentapolis to their legal sovereign, the Byzantine emperor, but instead formally granted them to the See of St. Peter. This act created the Patrimony of St. Peter, later known as the Papal States, a band of territory stretching across the Italian peninsula. This grant fundamentally transformed the nature of the papacy. The Bishop of Rome was no longer merely a spiritual leader and a major landowner. He was now a temporal prince, a sovereign ruler of a state in his own right. To bolster the legitimacy of this new and unprecedented status, a remarkable document emerged around this period, the Donation of Constantine. This famous forgery purported to be a decree from the first Christian emperor, granting the Pope temporal authority not just over Italy, but over the entire Western Empire. While its authenticity would be disproven centuries later, in the short term it provided a powerful ideological justification for papal sovereignty, grounding it in the legacy of Rome's imperial founder rather than in a recent grant from a Frankish king. The practical realities of this new role were immense. The Pope was now responsible for the civil administration of cities, the collection of taxes, the maintenance of infrastructure, and the administration of justice. Most significantly, he was now a military power, required to raise armies to defend his territories from Lombard incursions, Byzantine attempts at reconquest, and the ambitions of the powerful Roman aristocracy. The concerns of the papacy were now permanently divided. The Pope had to balance his universal spiritual responsibilities with the day-to-day political, financial, and military struggles of a minor Italian prince. This transformation was viewed in Constantinople with profound disdain. To the Byzantines, a bishop's role was spiritual. The idea of the Patriarch of Constantinople commanding troops or collecting taxes for a personal state was unthinkable and would have been seen as a deep corruption of his sacred office. The Pope's embrace of secular kingship was, in the Eastern view, a scandalous departure from apostolic tradition, creating yet another profound difference in how the two sees understood the proper role of the Church in the world. The settlement reached at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 proved to be a temporary truce rather than a lasting peace. The theological and political forces that had fueled the first wave of iconoclasm had not been extinguished. particularly within the powerful Anatolian military establishment. In 815, following a series of devastating military defeats at the hands of the Bulgars, Emperor Leo V the Armenian revived the iconoclast policy. A significant faction within the army had come to believe that the veneration of images was a form of idolatry that had cost the empire God's favor, leading directly to its battlefield failures. This second phase of iconoclasm was initiated with a new synod in Constantinople that repudiated the Council of 787 and reinstated the iconoclast decrees of an earlier generation. A new systematic persecution of the iconodules, or venerators of icons, began. The primary targets were again the monastic communities, who formed the backbone of the opposition. The most prominent defender of the icons during this period was Theodore the Studite, the abbot of the Studios monastery in Constantinople. Through his extensive theological writings and letters, he articulated a sophisticated defense of sacred images that would become foundational for Eastern Orthodox theology, suffering exile and imprisonment for his unwavering stance. The iconoclast policy was maintained by Leo's successors, Michael II and Theophilus, ensuring that for nearly 3 decades, the official theology of the Byzantine state was once again hostile to sacred images. The final reversal came with the death of the last iconoclast emperor, Theophilus, in 842. His wife, the Empress Theodora, who had secretly remained an iconodule throughout his reign, assumed the regency for their infant son, Michael III. Wasting little time, Theodora moved to definitively end the controversy. In March of 843, she convened a synod in Constantinople that formally deposed the iconoclast patriarch, John the Grammarian, and solemnly reaffirmed the decrees of the Second Council of Nicaea as the final word on the matter. To mark this definitive restoration, on the first Sunday of Lent, March 11, 843, a triumphant procession of clergy and laity carried icons back into the great church of Hagia Sophia. This event, known as the Triumph of Orthodoxy, is still commemorated every year in the Eastern Orthodox Church. It marked the final victory of the iconodules and permanently secured the place of icons at the heart of Eastern Christian worship, a victory achieved entirely within the East, without the direct intervention of the Roman Church. In the mid-9th century, a dispute over the patriarchal throne of Constantinople erupted that, while beginning as an internal political struggle, quickly escalated into a major confrontation with Rome. The affair centered on 2 figures, Ignatius and Photios. Ignatius, the incumbent patriarch, was a man of ascetic piety and a member of the strict monastic party. He came into conflict with Bardas, the powerful regent for the young emperor Michael III, by publicly denouncing his immoral conduct. In 858, Bardas engineered the patriarch's deposition and forced him into exile on charges of treason. To replace him, Bardas and the emperor chose not a bishop, but the most brilliant scholar and civil servant of the age, a layman named Photios. Photios was a man of immense learning, a leading figure in the intellectual revival known as the Macedonian Renaissance, but he had no ecclesiastical background. His elevation to the patriarchate was astonishingly rapid and canonically irregular. He was tonsured a monk on the first day, made a lector on the second, and then ordained subdeacon, deacon, and priest on 3 successive days. On Christmas Day of 858, less than a week after being a layman, he was consecrated as Patriarch of Constantinople. This uncanonical promotion immediately split the Byzantine Church into 2 hostile factions. The supporters of the exiled Ignatius, known as the Ignatians, refused to recognize the legitimacy of Photios's appointment. The Photians, representing a more moderate and state-aligned party, supported their new patriarch. Both sides made a critical decision. They appealed to Pope Nicholas I in Rome, each seeking his support to validate their position. This appeal presented the Pope with an unprecedented opportunity. By inviting him to adjudicate the legitimacy of the Constantinopolitan Patriarch, the Byzantines had inadvertently opened the door for a powerful assertion of Roman jurisdictional authority over the internal affairs of the Eastern Church. The purely internal Byzantine power struggle was about to become a direct contest between the claims of the papacy and the independence of the Eastern Patriarchate. The appeal from Constantinople arrived in Rome to a pope who was uniquely prepared, both temperamentally and theologically, to receive it. Pope Nicholas I, who ascended to the papal throne in 858, was one of the most formidable and ideologically committed pontiffs of the early Middle Ages. He possessed an unshakable belief in the supreme authority of the Roman See over the entire universal church. For Nicholas, the Pope was not merely the first among equals. He was the divinely appointed judge of all bishops, including the other patriarchs, with the final say in all major matters of faith and discipline. His pontificate was bolstered by the recent appearance of the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, a sophisticated collection of forged documents that attributed vast powers to the early popes, providing what was believed to be ancient precedent for Nicholas's expansive view of his own authority. When the letters from both Emperor Michael III and Photios arrived, alongside a separate appeal from the supporters of Ignatius, Nicholas saw not a distant political squabble, but a direct invitation to exercise his Petrine authority. He responded cautiously at first, dispatching 2 legates to Constantinople in 861, with instructions to investigate the matter and report back. He did not, however, grant them the authority to make a final judgment. Upon their arrival, the legates were subjected to intense imperial pressure. At a synod convened in Constantinople, they exceeded their mandate, accepted the validity of Photios' election, and formally recognized him as patriarch. When news of this reached Rome, Nicholas was incensed. He saw the actions of his legates as a betrayal and the Byzantine synod as an attempt to manipulate a papal decision through imperial coercion. In 863, Nicholas delivered his definitive response. He convened his own synod at the Lateran in Rome. This council formally repudiated the actions of his legates, nullified the decisions of the 861 Constantinopolitan Synod, and declared Photios to be deposed. It solemnly recognized Ignatius as the one legitimate patriarch. This was an act of direct and unprecedented jurisdictional power. The Pope in Rome was not merely offering an opinion, he was issuing a binding legal verdict upon the Patriarch of New Rome, asserting in the clearest possible terms his claim to be the supreme ruler of the universal church. The stage was set for a direct confrontation. The Roman condemnation of Photios in 863 was met with defiance in Constantinople. In 867, Photios convened his own large council, which, with the full backing of Emperor Michael III, retaliated by excommunicating and anathematizing Pope Nicholas I. The conflict had reached its zenith, with the heads of both the Eastern and Western churches having formally condemned one another. The impasse was broken not by negotiation, but by a violent palace coup in Constantinople later that same year. Emperor Michael III was assassinated, and his co-emperor, Basil I the Macedonian, seized sole power. Seeking to consolidate his rule and needing a political alliance with the West against the Arabs in Italy, Basil immediately reversed imperial policy. He deposed Photios and restored the aged Ignatius to the patriarchal throne, a move calculated to appease both the Ignatian faction at home and the papacy abroad. Pope Nicholas I had died before news of this reversal reached Rome, but his successor, Pope Adrian II, was equally committed to his predecessor's principles. Seizing the opportunity presented by the new emperor, Adrian agreed to send legates to a new council in Constantinople, but with strict conditions. This was not to be a council of debate, but a council of ratification for Rome's prior judgment. The council convened in the Hagia Sophia in late 869. Its proceedings were entirely dominated by the papal legates. Attendance was initially sparse, with only 12 bishops present at the first session, as many were reluctant to participate in what was clearly a politically motivated trial. The legates demanded that every attendee first sign the Libellus Satisfactionis, a formula of submission that confessed the primacy of the Roman See, and condemned all those Rome had condemned, including Photios. Over the course of several sessions, pressure from the emperor swelled the number of attendees to over 100. The council's work was a formality. Photios was brought before the assembly and, after refusing to speak, was solemnly anathematized. The acts of his 867 council were condemned, and its records were publicly burned. The Council of 869-870 was a total victory for the papal assertion of universal jurisdiction. It was, for a time, recognized in the West as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. In the East, however, it was seen as a humiliating imposition of foreign authority, a robber council dictated by papal legates and an emperor's political needs, and its memory would be a source of deep and lasting resentment. The papal victory of 869 proved to be both hollow and short-lived. Political realities in Constantinople were fluid, and the relationship between Emperor Basil I and the restored Patriarch Ignatius soon soured. Meanwhile, the deposed Photios, with his unparalleled intellect, was recalled to the imperial court to tutor the emperor's son and heir. When Ignatius died in 877, Emperor Basil, in a remarkable political reversal, chose to reappoint Photios to the patriarchal throne. This time, however, the political context was different. Basil's alliance with the West had served its purpose, and he now sought to heal the deep divisions within his own church, caused by the Photian affair. Both the emperor and the reinstated patriarch desired a new council, one that would undo the humiliation of 869, and restore Photios with the full sanction of the Church, including that of Rome. The Pope was now John VIII, a more pragmatic and politically flexible pontiff than his predecessors. Faced with severe military threats from the Arabs in southern Italy, John desperately needed the Byzantine emperor's naval assistance. This need for a military alliance made him willing to negotiate. He agreed to send legates to a new council in Constantinople, authorizing them to recognize Photios' restoration, provided Photios made a public apology for his past actions. The council that convened in the Hagia Sophia in 879 was a stark contrast to the one held a decade earlier. It was a massive assembly, with nearly 400 bishops in attendance, making it one of the largest councils of the first millennium. The papal legates were treated with honor, but were not allowed to dominate the proceedings. The council formally recognized Photios as the legitimate patriarch, and, in a direct repudiation of the previous gathering, it solemnly anathematized the Roman-led council of 869-870, striking it from the records. Most significantly, the council addressed the growing controversy over the creed. It explicitly condemned any and all additions to the original Nicene Constantinopolitan text, a clear and direct rejection of the Filioque clause being used by the Franks. The papal legates agreed to this canon. Communion between Rome and Constantinople was officially restored. In the East, this council was celebrated as a triumph, a true ecumenical gathering that had healed a schism and defended the integrity of the faith. In the West, its full implications were muted, but for a time peace had been achieved, based on a settlement that was a complete reversal of Rome's previous position. The restoration of communion, achieved at the Council of 879-880, was a triumph of political pragmatism, but it rested on a foundation of deliberate ambiguity that ensured its fragility. For Pope John VIII, the alliance with the Byzantine navy was a matter of survival, a necessity that outweighed the consistent theological principles of his predecessors. For Emperor Basil I, the unified support of his church was essential for the stability of his dynasty. The peace they brokered served these immediate needs, but it did not resolve the fundamental issues that had caused the conflict. In Constantinople, the council was celebrated as a great victory for orthodoxy. It was seen as a true ecumenical synod that had vindicated Photios, nullified a false Roman-led council, and, most importantly, defended the original creed against any alteration. In the East, the matter was considered settled. In Rome, the reality was far more complex. While Pope John VIII accepted the restoration of Photios, he never formally repudiated the Council of 869-870. A deep-seated inconsistency was thus created in the Western canonical tradition, with two contradictory councils both having been at different times approved by a pope. Over the next 2 centuries, Western canonists and theologians would grapple with this contradiction, with the prevailing tendency being to uphold the Council of 869, which supported papal supremacy, and to downplay or ignore the one of 879. The career of Photios himself demonstrated that the peace was more political than theological. When Emperor Basil died, his successor, Leo VI, deposed Photios for a second and final time in 886, not over any dispute with Rome, but for purely internal political reasons. The papacy raised no significant objection. The man who had been the centre of the storm was removed from the board, and the formal communion between the two sees continued. Yet, the memory of the schism left a permanent scar. The events had forced both sides to articulate their positions with unprecedented clarity. Rome had demonstrated its claim to universal jurisdiction in the most dramatic fashion, and the East had shown its absolute refusal to accept such a claim. The mutual excommunications, even though rescinded, were not forgotten. The Photian schism, though healed on the surface, had hardened the lines of division, creating a legacy of grievance and suspicion that would poison the relationship between the two churches for the next 150 years. The fragile peace brokered by the Photian settlement was followed by a century of profound degradation for the Roman See, a period so chaotic that it effectively removed the papacy as a serious player on the international stage. With the collapse of the Carolingian Empire in the late 9th century, the political protection that had secured Rome was gone. Italy descended into feudal anarchy, and the papacy fell hostage to the vicious power struggles of the local Roman aristocracy. This era, stretching from roughly 904 to 964, is known to historians as the Saculum Obscurum, the Dark Age of the papacy. During this time, the papal office was no longer a position of spiritual authority, but a secular prize to be seized by the most powerful noble faction. The dominant family was the house of Theophylact, whose matriarchs Theodora and her daughter Marozia effectively ruled Rome. Through a combination of political intrigue, strategic marriages, and outright force, they controlled papal elections, installing their lovers, sons, and grandsons onto the throne of St. Peter. This period is sometimes luridly referred to as the ponocracy, or rule of harlots, a term that reflects the scandalous reality of popes being chosen and deposed based on the whims of their aristocratic mistresses. The character of the popes during this era was often appalling. Sergius III, who came to power with the help of Theophylact, was rumoured to have had a son with the teenaged Marozia, a son who would later become Pope John XI. The nadir was reached with the pontificate of Pope John XII, Marozia's grandson, who ascended to the papacy as a teenager. His reign was a catalogue of depravity. The Lateran Palace was reportedly turned into a brothel, and he was accused of a host of crimes including simony, sacrilege, and murder. While these events unfolded in Rome, the Byzantine Church was experiencing a period of relative stability and intellectual renewal. There was little to no significant theological contact between the two sees during this time. To Constantinople, the papacy in Rome had ceased to be a credible theological partner or a serious rival for ecclesiastical leadership. It had become a corrupt provincial bishopric, mired in the squalid politics of a fallen city, its claims to universal authority rendered absurd by the moral bankruptcy of its occupants. Out of the depths of the papacy's degradation, the seeds of its powerful resurgence were sown not in Rome, but in a remote corner of Burgundy. In the year 910, Duke William I of Aquitaine founded a new monastery at Cluny. His foundation charter contained a revolutionary provision. The monastery was to be exempt from all local secular and episcopal control, subject only to the direct authority of the papacy. This single innovation, papal protection guaranteeing institutional independence, unleashed a powerful reform movement that would transform the entire Western Church. The Cluniac reform was, at its heart, a return to a strict observance of the Benedictine rule, with a particular emphasis on a magnificent and elaborate liturgy which they saw as the earthly participation in the worship of the angels. From this spiritual core, the movement launched a direct assault on the two great corruptions of the age: simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and Nicolaitism, the widespread practice of clerical marriage and concubinage. The Cluniac model proved immensely popular. Instead of founding independent daughter houses, Cluny created a vast, centralized congregation. Hundreds of monasteries across Europe were either founded by or reformed according to Cluniac principles, and all remained subordinate to the abbot of Cluny. This created an international, disciplined network of reform-minded clergy, a spiritual army loyal to an ideal of a purified church, free from the control of feudal lords and local bishops. For over a century, this movement gathered strength, spreading its ideals of clerical celibacy and the condemnation of simony throughout Western Christendom. By the mid-11th century, the Cluniac spirit finally captured Rome itself. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, a pious ruler, disgusted by the chaos of the Roman aristocracy, intervened to depose 3 rival popes and began appointing a series of German reform-minded pontiffs. These new popes, such as Leo IX, brought with them the ideals forged at Cluny. They filled the Roman Curia with like-minded reformers from across Europe, men like Humbert of Silva Candida and the monk Hildebrand, who would later become Pope Gregory VII. The papacy was thus transformed. Rescued from its provincial degradation, it was remade into the zealous, centralized headquarters of an international reform movement, determined to assert its authority and purify the entire church. This new resurgent papacy was disciplined, ideologically coherent, and fiercely committed to its own supremacy. It was this assertive, reformed institution that would soon turn its gaze eastward to confront the Church of Constantinople. While the reformed papacy was consolidating its ideological power, a new and disruptive military force was fundamentally altering the political landscape of southern Italy, the last remaining foothold of Byzantine power in the West. Beginning in the early 11th century, small bands of Norman adventurers, initially serving as mercenaries, began arriving in the region. They sold their formidable military skills to the highest bidder, fighting for the Lombard princes, the Byzantine governors, and various local factions in the chaotic and fragmented political world of the Italian south. Their effectiveness in battle, however, soon transformed them from soldiers for hire into conquerors in their own right. Led by ambitious figures like the sons of Tancred of Hauteville, most notably Robert Guiscard, the Normans began to systematically seize the lands they were paid to defend. They carved out feudal principalities for themselves, conquering Lombard territories and, most significantly, beginning to roll back the frontiers of the Byzantine Catapanate of Italy. Initially, the newly assertive papacy in Rome viewed these Norman freebooters as a dangerous threat to its own security and territorial claims. In 1053, Pope Leo IX personally led an army composed of Italian and German troops to crush the Norman expansion. The two forces met at the Battle of Civitate, which resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the papal army and the capture of the Pope himself. This disaster, however, led to a stunning political realignment. The papacy, recognizing the futility of military opposition and the immense power of the Normans, executed a strategic reversal. At the Treaty of Melfi in 1059, Pope Nicholas II formally invested the Norman leaders Robert Guiscard and Richard of Aversa with the territories they had already conquered. In exchange, the Normans swore an oath of fealty, becoming direct vassals of the Holy See. This alliance was a masterstroke for both sides. The Normans gained the ultimate prize of legitimacy for their conquests, transforming them from robber barons into sanctioned rulers. The papacy, in turn, secured a powerful and permanent military protector in its own backyard, finally freeing it from its reliance on the distant and often uncooperative Holy Roman Emperor. For the Byzantine Empire, this was a fatal blow. The papacy had now allied itself with the very power that was actively conquering its last Italian possessions, creating a unified Catholic front that would ultimately squeeze Byzantine influence out of the peninsula entirely. Amidst the high-level disputes over papal authority and imperial politics, a seemingly minor liturgical difference emerged as a potent symbol of the growing estrangement: the type of bread used in the Eucharist. This was not a new variation, but by the 11th century it had become a focal point for mutual condemnation. The Eastern Church, following what it held to be the ancient and universal tradition, exclusively used leavened bread, or artos. The theological significance was profound. The leaven symbolized the presence of the Holy Spirit and the new risen life of Christ. For the East, the Eucharist was a celebration of the resurrection, and the living leavened bread was a direct expression of that belief. The Western Church, however, had gradually adopted the use of unleavened bread, or azymes, a practice that seems to have become widespread after the 9th century. This custom likely originated from a desire to imitate the historical circumstances of the Last Supper, which took place during the Jewish festival of Passover, when only unleavened bread was consumed. For the Latins, the unleavened wafer came to symbolize the purity and sinlessness of Christ's body. What had for centuries been a matter of differing local custom was transformed into a weapon of theological polemic in the charged atmosphere of the mid-11th century. Eastern theologians, most notably Patriarch Michael Cerularius, began to vehemently attack the Latin practice. They condemned the use of azymes as a heretical, Judaizing tendency, an unacceptable return to the dead rituals of the Old Covenant. From the Greek perspective, the Latins, by using lifeless, unleavened bread, were failing to properly signify the living reality of the resurrected Christ in the Eucharist. They derisively labelled the Westerners Azymites. The Roman reformers, in turn, defended their practice as being more faithful to the actions of Christ himself. They viewed the Greek use of leavened bread as a deviation from the historical institution of the sacrament. This seemingly technical question of baking thus became a stand-in for the much larger, unspoken issue: which church had remained faithful to the apostolic tradition? It was no longer a simple difference in liturgy. It was a profound disagreement over the very nature of the sacrament, and each side saw the other's custom as a grave theological error. The simmering theological and cultural resentments finally boiled over into direct administrative action in the year 1052. The instigator was the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerularius, a man of formidable intellect, immense political ambition, and a deeply ingrained hostility toward the Latin West. The immediate context was the complex political situation in southern Italy, where the Byzantine emperor was seeking a military alliance with the papacy against the encroaching Normans. This backdrop of attempted political cooperation makes the Patriarch's actions all the more striking and provocative. For centuries, a small but significant community of Latins had resided in Constantinople, composed of Amalfitan merchants, Varangian mercenaries, and various pilgrims. These communities maintained their own churches where they worshipped according to the Roman rite, a practice long tolerated by the Byzantine authorities. Cerularius, however, saw this Latin presence as a direct challenge to his patriarchal authority and a source of theological contamination within his city. Acting with decisive force, he ordered all Latin Rite churches in Constantinople to be closed. He further commanded them to abandon their customs, particularly the use of unleavened bread, and to conform to Greek liturgical practice. When they refused, imperial troops were used to enforce the decree, with reports reaching the West that consecrated hosts the azymes so despised by the Greeks were trampled underfoot. This was not merely a local disciplinary measure, it was a public and unambiguous declaration that the Patriarch of Constantinople considered the central liturgical practice of the Roman Church to be illegitimate. To ensure his message was understood, Cerularius commissioned Leo, the Archbishop of Ohrid, to write a polemical letter addressed to the Pope and all the bishops of the West. This letter was a blistering attack on a range of Latin customs, condemning not only the use of unleavened bread, but also practices such as fasting on Saturdays. The letter was a calculated insult designed to provoke a response. By closing the churches and launching this theological assault, Cerularius had thrown down the gauntlet. He had transformed abstract theological disagreements into a concrete act of ecclesiastical persecution, creating a crisis that the assertive, reform-minded papacy in Rome could not possibly ignore. The provocative letter from the East and the news of the church closures in Constantinople arrived in Rome to a papacy that was uniquely unprepared for diplomatic subtlety and uniquely prepared for ideological confrontation. The man on the papal throne was Pope Leo IX, the very embodiment of the new reformed papacy. He was not a product of the Roman nobility, but a German aristocrat, Bruno of Egesheim-Dagsburg, a cousin of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, who had placed him in power in 1049. His appointment marked the definitive triumph of the Cluniac reform movement over the degradation of the Saeculum Obscurum. Leo was a man forged in the crucible of this reform. He was fiercely pious, energetic, and possessed an iron will. He was the first pope in centuries to travel extensively beyond Rome, personally presiding over synods in Pavia, Reims, and Mainz, where he relentlessly pursued his reformist agenda, deposing bishops for simony and strictly enforcing clerical celibacy. His vision of the Church was one of centralized authority, with a purified clergy obedient to a supreme and active papacy. Central to his worldview was an absolute and uncompromising belief in the primacy of the Roman See. He surrounded himself with a coterie of like-minded non-Roman reformers, chief among them the rigid and polemical Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. For Leo and his circle, the Pope was the head and hinge of the entire Church, and the customs of the Roman Church were not local traditions, but the universal standard for all of Christendom. Therefore, the actions of Patriarch Michael Cerularius were not interpreted as a distant ecclesiastical dispute. They were seen as a direct act of rebellion, an intolerable challenge to the authority vested in the successor of St. Peter. The attack on the use of unleavened bread was not a liturgical quibble, it was an assault on the apostolic tradition of Rome itself. Leo's response was conditioned by this mindset. There was no room for compromise when the fundamental structure of the Church, as he understood it, was at stake. He was not a man to be trifled with, and the crisis initiated by Cerularius would be met not with negotiation, but with a forceful and unequivocal assertion of Roman authority. The man who occupied the patriarchal throne in Constantinople was, in many ways, the perfect foil for the reformers in Rome. Michael Cerularius was not a monk or a theologian by training, but a high-ranking civil servant who had once plotted to seize the imperial throne for himself. After his conspiracy failed, he was forced into the clergy, but he brought with him the ambition, political acumen, and immense pride of a Byzantine aristocrat. He ascended to the patriarchate in 1043, possessing a clear and unshakable vision of his office. For Cerularius, the Patriarch of Constantinople was the supreme head of the Eastern Church, a spiritual authority co-equal to the emperor's temporal authority. He saw the Byzantine Church and Empire as a single, indivisible symphony, and he was determined to protect its integrity from all external threats. The greatest of these threats, in his view, was the newly assertive papacy. He viewed the Roman reform movement not as a pious effort to purify the Church, but as a revolutionary and dangerous innovation. The papal claims to universal jurisdiction, the enforcement of clerical celibacy, and the alteration of the creed with the filioque were, to Cerularius, arrogant deviations from apostolic tradition. He saw the papacy as a once great patriarchate that had fallen into heresy, and was now attempting to impose its errors on the true centre of orthodoxy, Constantinople. His decision to close the Latin churches was not an impulsive act, but a calculated assertion of his authority, and a clear signal that he would not tolerate what he considered to be heretical practices within his jurisdiction. Unlike the popes of the Dark Age, who were too weak to be a threat, the reformed papacy under Leo IX was a powerful ideological rival. Cerularius was determined to meet this challenge head-on, not through compromise, but by demonstrating the superiority and independence of the See of New Rome. He was a formidable, unyielding figure, convinced of the righteousness of his cause, and fully prepared for a confrontation that would definitively establish the boundaries of their respective worlds. In response to the crisis initiated by Michael Cerularius, Pope Leo IX decided on a course of direct confrontation, dispatching a formal legation to Constantinople in 1054. The choice of personnel for this mission would prove to be fateful. To lead the delegation, Leo selected the man who was the intellectual architect of the new assertive papacy, Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. Humbert was a French Benedictine monk from Lorraine, a zealous product of the Cluniac reform movement, and the most powerful ideologue in the Roman Curia. He was a brilliant canon lawyer and a fierce polemicist, but he was also notoriously rigid, arrogant, and utterly convinced of the absolute supremacy of the Roman See. He had already authored a blistering response to the Greek accusations, a treatise that was less a theological argument and more a diatribe against the supposed errors and insubordination of the Eastern Church. For Humbert, there was nothing to negotiate. The Greeks were to be corrected and brought into submission. Accompanying Humbert were two other legates, Frederick of Lorraine, the papal chancellor and brother of the Duke of Lorraine, and Peter, the Archbishop of Amalfi, a city with close commercial ties to the Byzantine Empire. They were entrusted with papal letters addressed to both the Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos and to the Patriarch. The mission had a dual purpose: to secure the Emperor's military support against the Normans and to demand that the Patriarch cease his anti-Latin activities and recognize the supreme authority of the Pope. A critical event occurred while the legation was still en route to the east. In April of 1054, Pope Leo IX died in Rome. According to the canon law of the time, the authority of papal legates expired immediately upon the death of the pontiff who had commissioned them. From that moment forward, Humbert and his companions legally represented no one. Their mandate was void, and their proper course of action would have been to return to Rome to await the election of a new pope. Humbert, however, was not a man to be deterred by legal technicalities when he believed he was on a divine mission. He made the momentous decision to conceal the news of the Pope's death and to proceed to Constantinople, determined to carry out his instructions as if his authority were still intact. The legation that was meant to heal a rift was now proceeding under a false pretense, led by an uncompromising ideologue whose legal authority had ceased to exist. The papal legation arrived in Constantinople in June of 1054 and was initially received with the honour appropriate to their station. The Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos, who was still pursuing a political and military alliance with the papacy, welcomed them warmly and provided them with lodging in the imperial palace. The emperor's primary goal was secular, to secure a pact against the Normans. He was therefore inclined to smooth over any ecclesiastical difficulties and encourage a swift reconciliation. Cardinal Humbert, however, had no interest in the emperor's political agenda and made no effort to engage in diplomatic pleasantries. His conduct from the outset was tactless and provocative. He immediately presented the emperor with the papal letter, but he refused to give a copy to Patriarch Michael Cerularius, instead delivering a public and insulting sermon against him. The first official meeting between the legates and the Patriarch was a disaster. Humbert, acting with the full force of his, now legally void authority, refused to show Cerularius the customary signs of respect due to a Patriarch. He did not greet him properly and immediately launched into a series of accusations demanding submission rather than entering into dialogue. Cerularius, a man of immense pride and a master of Byzantine court protocol, was deeply offended by this flagrant breach of etiquette. He was also suspicious of the papal letters the legates carried, noting irregularities in the seals and questioning their authenticity. When he discovered that the legates had publicly condemned the teachings of a respected Byzantine theologian, Nikitas Stethetos, without any formal hearing, he broke off all contact. The Patriarch refused to meet with the legates again, declaring that he would not discuss such grave matters with men whose arrogance and questionable credentials made them unfit for theological discourse. Humbert was left fuming in the imperial palace, his mission completely stalled. The emperor's attempts to mediate were futile. The cardinal refused to moderate his stance, and the Patriarch refused to engage with a man who had treated him with such contempt. For weeks the legates remained in the city, their public presence a source of growing tension, while Humbert penned even more vitriolic pamphlets against the Greek Church, further poisoning an already toxic atmosphere. The impasse in Constantinople festered for weeks, transforming from a diplomatic failure into a public war of words. Confined to the palace, Cardinal Humbert channeled his frustration into a series of vitriolic written attacks. He composed a treatise, The Dialogue Between a Roman and a Constantinopolitan, which was not a dialogue at all, but a scathing monologue condemning the entire Greek Church. In it he accused the Byzantines of a host of heresies and errors, dredging up every point of contention that had accumulated over the centuries. He condemned the marriage of their clergy, attacked their liturgical practices, and, most offensively, accused them of having deleted the filioque from the original creed, a historical falsehood that betrayed a profound ignorance of the text's history. This document, along with other polemical pamphlets, was translated into Greek and circulated throughout the city, ensuring that the legate's insults reached the widest possible audience. Patriarch Michael Cerularius, for his part, refused to be drawn into a direct debate with men he considered to be illegitimate envoys. Instead, he worked to consolidate his own position. He publicly exposed the irregularities in the papal letters and likely spread the now confirmed news of Pope Leo IX's death, which completely undermined the legate's legal standing. In his sermons at Hagia Sophia, he condemned the arrogance of the Franks and their heretical innovations, portraying himself as the defender of the one true orthodox faith against barbarian corruption. Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos found himself in an impossible position. His desperately needed political alliance with the West was being destroyed by the very men sent to secure it. He made repeated attempts to arrange a formal public debate, hoping to find some common ground, but his efforts were futile. Humbert demanded a full retraction and submission from the Patriarch as a precondition for any discussion. Cerularius, now backed by an inflamed publican clergy, refused to grant any legitimacy to the legates by meeting with them. The negotiations had failed utterly. The insults had escalated from private snubs to public anathemas. Humbert, realizing that his mission to secure the Patriarch's submission was a lost cause, concluded that his only remaining option was a final, dramatic act that would demonstrate the supreme authority of Rome in the most unambiguous way possible. Having concluded that no submission from the Patriarch was forthcoming, Cardinal Humbert resolved to make a final, indelible statement of Roman authority. On the afternoon of Saturday, July 16, 1054, he and the other two legates made their way to the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia. The timing was chosen for maximum dramatic effect. The cathedral was filled with clergy and laity preparing for the afternoon liturgy. The legates strode through the imperial doors, marched directly to the high altar, and, in a gesture of profound and calculated defiance, placed upon it a formal bull of excommunication. The document itself, which Humbert had drafted, was a catalogue of accusations against Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his supporters. It was a deeply flawed and polemical text, filled with historical inaccuracies and theological exaggerations. It condemned the Greeks for, among other things, rebaptizing Latins, allowing priests to marry, and, most egregiously, for having omitted the filioque from the creed, a charge that was the precise inverse of the historical reality. The bull named Michael Cerularius, Leo of Ohrid, and all their followers as heretics and formally excommunicated them. After depositing the document on the altar, the legates turned their backs on the stunned congregation, walked out of the cathedral, and symbolically shook the dust from their feet. This act was a piece of pure ecclesiastical theatre, designed to be an unanswerable assertion of papal power. It was also canonically invalid on multiple levels. The Pope who had sent the legates, Leo IX, had been dead for 3 months, rendering their authority legally void. Furthermore, an excommunication is a disciplinary act against a specific person. It was not within the legates' power, even if they had been legitimate, to excommunicate an entire patriarchate. But the legal subtleties were lost in the shocking reality of the event. For the first time, A representative of the Roman Church had entered the mother church of Eastern Christendom and had presumed to cast its leader out of the universal church. The immediate reaction in Constantinople was one of shock, which quickly turned to fury as the contents of the bull were translated and made public. The emperor, who had been played for a fool, was horrified, but the popular outrage against the impious barbarians was so great that he could do little to contain it. The immediate aftermath of the papal legate's departure was chaos. The popular fury in Constantinople, stoked by weeks of Humbert's public insults, was now directed at the emperor, who was blamed for having received the envoys and failing to protect the honour of the church. Patriarch Michael Cerularius, having been publicly vindicated by the legate's extreme actions, seized the political and ecclesiastical initiative. He retrieved the bull of excommunication from the altar of Hagia Sophia and presented it to the emperor, demanding a formal response. Under immense pressure from both the clergy and the enraged populace, Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos had no choice but to authorize the convening of a synod. On July 24, 1054, just 8 days after Humbert's dramatic act, Cerularius presided over a permanent synod in Constantinople. This was not a hastily assembled mob, but the standing administrative and judicial body of the Patriarchate, composed of the most senior bishops and metropolitans. The purpose of the gathering was to conduct a formal canonical examination of the bull and to formulate the official response of the Eastern Church. The synod's proceedings were deliberate and legalistic. The bull was publicly read and its contents analysed. The fathers of the synod concluded that the document was a work of heresy and insolence, drafted by impious men who had come out of the darkness of the West into the land of piety. Crucially, the synod made a careful and significant distinction. Its condemnation was not directed at the Pope in Rome, who, they correctly noted, was deceased, nor at the Latin Church as a whole. The anathema was specifically and exclusively targeted at Cardinal Humbert and the other two legates. They were condemned not as representatives of the Roman Church, but as rogue agents who had acted wickedly and beyond their authority. The synod then issued its own formal sentence of excommunication against the three legates and all who supported their actions. A copy of the Latin bull, with a Greek translation of the synod's condemnation attached, was publicly burned in the Forum of Constantinople. The Eastern Church had now responded in kind, but with a carefully aimed counterstrike. While the break was now mutual, the Eastern anathema was a precise, surgical act against the offending individuals, a final, defiant rejection of their claim to hold any jurisdiction in the East. The exchange of excommunications in July of 1054 created a formal state of schism between the sees of Rome and Constantinople, yet the immediate significance of the event was not fully appreciated by contemporaries. This was not the first time a Roman legate and a Constantinopolitan patriarch had condemned one another, and previous breaches had, in time, been healed. The anathemas themselves were legally specific and personal. Humbert's bull had targeted Michael Cerularius and his supporters, not the entire Eastern Church or the Byzantine Emperor. Likewise, the Constantinopolitan Synod had carefully directed its condemnation solely at the three papal legates as individuals, not at the papacy or the Latin West as a whole. In the immediate aftermath, there was no general severing of communion between the churches. The other Eastern patriarchs in Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem were not directly involved in the dispute. They continued to commemorate the Pope of Rome in their liturgies, and it would take decades, and in some cases centuries, for the break initiated in Constantinople to filter down and become a reality throughout the rest of the Orthodox world. In the West, the return of the legates was not met with a universal call to condemn the East. The new Pope, Stephen IX, who was none other than Frederick of Lorraine, one of the legates, was preoccupied with the Norman threat and internal church reforms. While the actions of Humbert were not repudiated, there was no formal papal bull excommunicating the entire Eastern Church in response to the events of 1054. What made this moment different, what made it the formal beginning of the schism, was that this time the breach was never healed. The underlying causes, the papal claims to universal jurisdiction, the filioque, and the deep cultural and political estrangement, had become too profound to overcome. The mutual anathemas of 1054 acted as a formal declaration of incompatibility. They were the legal crystallization of centuries of growing apart, a point of no return not because of the specific individuals they condemned, but because they represented the moment when the two great centers of Christendom formally and publicly declared that they could no longer remain in communion on the other's terms. 40 years after the mutual anathemas, an unprecedented event forced the estranged churches of Rome and Constantinople into a state of uneasy and ultimately doomed cooperation. In 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, facing the catastrophic loss of Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks, dispatched envoys to Pope Urban II. His appeal was a pragmatic military request, a call for Western mercenary knights to help bolster his depleted armies and push back the Turkish advance. What he received was something entirely different, a phenomenon born of the Western reform movement that he could neither anticipate nor control. At the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II transformed the emperor's plea for mercenaries into a call for a crusade, an armed pilgrimage under papal authority to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem. This was a distinctly Western concept, a holy war that fused feudal warrior culture with popular piety, an idea alien to the Byzantine tradition of professional state-controlled warfare. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of Westerners, from knights to peasants, took the cross and began the long march east. Their arrival at the gates of Constantinople in 1096 presented Alexios with a severe crisis. Instead of a manageable contingent of professional soldiers, he was faced with vast, undisciplined, and ideologically fervent armies. A period of tense cooperation ensued. Alexios, a master of diplomacy, supplied the Crusaders with provisions and naval support in exchange for a sworn oath from their leaders to return any formerly Byzantine cities they captured to imperial control. This arrangement bore initial fruit at the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, which was successfully captured and handed over to the Byzantines. But the fragile alliance quickly fractured under the strain of the campaign. During the brutal year-long siege of Antioch, the Crusaders felt abandoned by the emperor, who they believed had failed to provide adequate support. When the city finally fell, the Norman leader Bohemond, a long-standing enemy of the empire, refused to honor his oath and kept Antioch for himself, establishing the first independent Crusader state. This act was a profound betrayal in Byzantine eyes. The crusade, which had begun with the potential to heal the breach through joint military action against a common enemy, had instead deepened the schism. It introduced a new and dangerous element, a rival Latin military and political presence on Byzantine soil, creating a legacy of deep-seated mistrust and resentment. The establishment of the Crusader states the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and soon, the Kingdom of Jerusalem created a new and deeply damaging front in the conflict between the Eastern and Western churches. The issue was no longer one of military betrayal, but of direct ecclesiastical colonization. As the Western crusading lords carved out their new territories, they brought with them not just their armies, but their own church structure, and they had no intention of submitting to the authority of the local Greek Orthodox hierarchy. In each of the conquered cities, the Crusaders faced a choice: cooperate with the existing Greek patriarchs and bishops, or replace them. They invariably chose the latter. In Antioch, the ancient see of St. Peter, the Norman prince Bohemond forcibly expelled the Greek patriarch, John the Oxite, and installed a Latin patriarch in his place. This was a shocking act. A Western prelate now occupied one of the foundational thrones of the Eastern Pentarchy, not through canonical process, but by right of conquest. A similar process unfolded in Jerusalem after its capture in 1099. The Greek patriarch had fled the city during the siege, and the Crusaders, rather than inviting his return, established their own Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem. This pattern was repeated across the Levant as the Crusader states consolidated their power. Wherever they ruled, Latin bishops, loyal to the Pope in Rome, were appointed to ancient eastern sees, while the native Greek bishops were exiled or forced into a subordinate position. This created the unprecedented and canonically monstrous situation of two rival bishops claiming the same see, one Latin and one Greek, one in power and one in exile. For the local Orthodox Christian population, the schism was no longer an abstract dispute between distant hierarchs in Rome and Constantinople. It was now a painful, lived reality. Their legitimate bishops had been driven out and replaced by foreign prelates who spoke a different language and practiced different rites. To the Byzantines, this was the ultimate confirmation of their worst fears. The crusade had been a pretext for a hostile takeover, not just of their territory, but of their church. The imposition of a parallel Latin hierarchy was seen as a spiritual conquest, a declaration that the entire Greek church was schismatic and illegitimate, its ancient sees now vacant and available for Roman appointment. If the anathemas of 1054 had been a formal declaration of divorce, and the First Crusade a source of deep mistrust, the Fourth Crusade was the act of violent, irreparable betrayal that sealed the schism in the popular mind. The Crusade, which assembled in Venice in 1202, was originally intended to attack Muslim power in Egypt. However, due to a complex web of financial desperation and political intrigue, it was diverted. The crusading army was unable to pay the exorbitant fees demanded by the Venetians for naval transport. At this critical juncture, an exiled Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, arrived with a proposition. If the Crusaders would help him overthrow the reigning emperor in Constantinople, he would pay their debt to Venice, finance their subsequent campaign, and, most crucially, submit the entire Eastern Church to the authority of the Pope. Lured by this offer, and under the shrewd guidance of the aged Venetian doge, Enrico Dandolo, the crusade turned its arms not against the Saracens, but against the largest Christian city in the world. In 1203, the Crusaders successfully breached the city's defences and installed their claimant as Emperor Alexios IV. But the promises were built on fantasy. The imperial treasury was empty, and the Byzantine populace was enraged by the presence of the Latin army and the prospect of ecclesiastical submission. When Alexios IV was deposed and murdered in a popular uprising, the Crusaders, feeling cheated and now without a purpose, made a cold-blooded decision to conquer the city for themselves. In April of 1204, they breached the sea walls and subjected Constantinople to a 3-day sack of unimaginable brutality. This was not a disciplined military occupation, it was a chaotic frenzy of greed and destruction. The great library was burned, its ancient manuscripts lost forever. Bronze statues that had adorned the city since the time of Constantine were melted down for coin. The most sacred churches, including the Hagia Sophia, were systematically desecrated. Altars were smashed, precious relics were stolen and shipped back to the West, and a prostitute was reportedly enthroned on the patriarchal cathedra. For the Greek-speaking world, this was the ultimate horror. An army that marched under the sign of the cross had conquered and defiled their holy city. The schism was no longer a matter for theologians. It was now a raw, open wound of memory, a conviction that the Latin West was not a sister church, but a predatory and barbaric enemy. In 1261, the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos achieved what had seemed impossible. His forces recaptured Constantinople, bringing an end to the 57-year rule of the Latin Empire established by the Fourth Crusade. This restoration, however, placed the revived empire in a position of extreme geopolitical peril. The most formidable threat came from the west, in the person of Charles of Anjou, the powerful king of Sicily, who inherited the Latin claim to Constantinople and was actively planning a massive crusade to reconquer the city. Facing the prospect of annihilation, Michael VIII pursued a desperate diplomatic strategy. He concluded that the only way to neutralize the threat from Charles was to secure the protection of the one power that could restrain him, the papacy. To achieve this, he He was willing to pay the ultimate price, ecclesiastical union on Rome's terms. Pope Gregory X, who was more concerned with launching a new crusade to the Holy Land than with Byzantine politics, saw the emperor's proposal as an opportunity to finally heal the schism and unite Christendom under his authority. He convened a great council at Lyon in 1274 to formalize the union. The Byzantine delegation that arrived at Lyon was not composed of theologians free to debate, but of imperial envoys under strict orders to agree to whatever the Pope demanded. The terms of the union were a complete capitulation by the East. The emperor's representatives formally accepted the Latin doctrine of the filioque, the concept of purgatory, and, most critically, they confessed the supreme jurisdictional primacy of the Roman pontiff over the entire church. The union was proclaimed with great solemnity, and for a brief moment it appeared on paper that the Great Schism was over. But the Union of Lyon was a political fiction, an act of statecraft imposed from the top down with no genuine support from the Eastern Church. When the imperial envoys returned to Constantinople, the terms were met with a firestorm of opposition. The Byzantine clergy, the powerful monastic communities, and the laity overwhelmingly rejected the union as a complete betrayal of the orthodox faith. They derisively called its few supporters phronantes ta Latina, those who think like Latins. The emperor was forced to use imprisonment, exile, and persecution to impose his policy, but he could not break the resistance. The union, though officially proclaimed, was never implemented in the East. It was a union of emperors and popes, not of churches or peoples, and it collapsed the moment the political pressure was removed. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople, a few islands, and a small part of the Peloponnese. It was surrounded and existentially threatened by the inexorable advance of the Ottoman Turks. In a final, desperate gamble for survival, Emperor John VIII Palaiologos looked to the West for military aid, knowing that the price would be the one thing he had to offer: the submission of his church. Pope Eugene IV, himself embroiled in a struggle with the conciliar movement that sought to limit his own power, saw an opportunity to achieve the ultimate prize of a reunited Christendom under papal authority. The result was the most serious and sustained theological encounter between the two churches since the schism began. The Council of Florence. Unlike the politically dictated union at Lyon, this was a genuine theological council. The emperor himself led a massive Greek delegation that included the Patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph II, and the leading theologians and scholars of the Byzantine world, including the staunchly anti-union Mark of Ephesus and the brilliant humanist Bessarion. The council opened in Ferrara in 1438 and later moved to Florence. For months, the two sides engaged in intense, sophisticated debates on the core issues that divided them. They meticulously argued the scriptural and patristic basis for the filioque, the nature of purgatory, the use of unleavened bread, and the extent of papal primacy. The debates were intellectually rigorous but took place under the immense pressure of the emperor's political desperation. He needed a union to secure a crusade, and he systematically coerced his own delegation to accept the Latin positions. After prolonged and often bitter argument, a formula of union was finally agreed upon. It was a near-total victory for the Latin theological position. The Decree of Union, Leiton Caeli, Let the Heavens Rejoice, proclaimed in July 1439, affirmed the filioque as theologically sound, defined the doctrine of purgatory, and, most critically, declared that the Pope of Rome possessed primacy over the whole world and was the true vicar of Christ. Nearly the entire Greek delegation, exhausted and under imperial command, signed the decree. The one conspicuous and crucial exception was Mark of Ephesus, who refused, becoming the standard-bearer for the opposition. The union, celebrated with great pomp in Florence, was dead on arrival in the East. The promised crusade from the West was a catastrophic failure, and the Byzantine populace, led by the monks, rejected the settlement as a complete betrayal of orthodoxy. The Council of Florence, the last and most profound attempt at reconciliation, had failed. The failure of the Union of Florence sealed the fate of the Byzantine Empire. The promised military aid from the West never materialized in any significant form, and the internal religious division created by the council paralyzed the city's final years. A popular saying of the time, attributed to the high-ranking official Lucas Notaras, captured the mood. Better to see the turban of the Turk ruling in the city than the Latin mitre. In the final days before the siege, the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, desperate for any aid, officially proclaimed the Florentine Union in the Hagia Sophia, but the act was met with riots and was boycotted by the majority of the clergy and people. In the spring of 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, armed with immense manpower and powerful new siege cannons, laid siege to Constantinople. The city, defended by a tiny force of around 70 men, held out for 53 days against an army of over 80. On May 29, 1453, the Ottoman forces breached the ancient Theodosian walls, and the city fell. The last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the breach, and with him, the 1,000-year-old Byzantine Empire came to a violent end. The fall of the city was a geopolitical and psychological cataclysm. For the West, it was a disaster, but a distant one. For the Greek-speaking world, it was the end of everything. The immediate ecclesiastical consequence was the solidification of the Orthodox Church under non-Christian rule. The new Ottoman masters, for reasons of administrative convenience, needed a single leader to represent the entire Christian population, or millet. Mehmed II appointed the staunchly anti-unionist monk Gennadios Scholarios as the new patriarch, granting him civil as well as religious authority over all Orthodox Christians in the empire. This act ironically strengthened the position of the Patriarchate and ensured the definitive repudiation of the Union of Florence. The schism was now a permanent political reality. With Constantinople, the Second Rome, now under Islamic rule, the center of gravity for the independent Orthodox world shifted northward to the rising Grand Duchy of Moscow. Russian churchmen began to articulate the powerful ideology of Moscow as the Third Rome, viewing themselves as the last true heirs of the Orthodox Empire. The fall of Constantinople had not only ended an empire, it had cemented the division of Christendom, creating two separate and distinct worlds, one Latin and one Orthodox, that would continue to evolve in isolation for centuries to come. The centuries following the fall of Constantinople saw the two halves of Christendom evolve in almost complete isolation, their separation solidifying into distinct cultural and theological worlds. The Western Church underwent the seismic upheavals of the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, its theology increasingly defined by scholastic methods and its structure ever more centralized around the authority of the papacy. The Eastern Orthodox world, meanwhile, navigated the complex reality of survival under Ottoman rule, a period which, while often oppressive, fostered a deep sense of spiritual resilience and preserved its liturgical and theological traditions unchanged. As Ottoman power waned, the Orthodox Church saw the rise of national autocephalous churches, further decentralizing its structure. For nearly 500 years, there was little meaningful contact. The schism accepted as a permanent and unalterable fact of history. The 20th century, however, witnessed the dawn of the modern ecumenical movement, a new spirit of dialogue driven by a shared sense of loss over a divided Christendom. The first significant gesture occurred in 1964, when Pope Paul VI and the ecumenical patriarch Athenagoras I met in Jerusalem, the first meeting between a pope and an ecumenical patriarch in over 500 years. This historic encounter paved the way for the most symbolic act of reconciliation to date. On December 7, 1965, on the eve of the closing of the Second Vatican Council, the two leaders issued a joint declaration. In simultaneous ceremonies in Rome and Istanbul, they formally nullified and lifted the mutual anathemas of 1054. This was not a restoration of full communion. It was a gesture of regret, a commitment to remove the memory of the condemnations from the life of the Church and to pursue a dialogue of charity. This new era was perhaps best encapsulated by the metaphor famously employed by Pope John Paul II, who spoke of the Church needing to breathe again with its two lungs, Eastern and Western. Formal theological dialogue was established, tackling the core issues of papal primacy and the filioque. While these profound obstacles remain unresolved and full communion has not been restored, the legacy of the Great Schism in the modern era is one of a painful division, now tempered by a shared and sincere hope for its eventual healing.